This is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on the CN rail protests in Canada. And I am apologizing at the very beginning of this video because I'm going to totally brutalize the pronunciation of the different native tribes' names. I just don't know how to say it that well. It's suwet'en tribe, and I'm hoping that I'm saying that correctly. So I apologize if I'm not. They see right in Canada, we have this big issue. Canada is a huge nation, okay? And in the middle of our nation, or kind of a little bit middle to west side of our nation, is Alberta. Alberta is this oil-rich province. Now, the way the oil is inside of the land is it's in what's called tar sand. And that tar sand there is actually more oil there than all of Saudi Arabia and like the Middle East. There's a huge amount of oil, but it's in this tar. And what happens is, in order to refine the oil, we have to basically export it. And it's actually hard to transport. The way that they transport it now is through rail or truck. And it's not the best way of transporting it because, there's rail issues and there's various problems that can exist when they're trying to transport this oil. So one of the things that they do, or looking at doing, I should say, is looking at a pipeline. So if you could just pipe it to the coast where you can then put it on a ship, then you can send it anywhere in the world. So that's the background of the situation in Canada, that we have this real issue where we need these pipelines in order to export this huge resource that we have, this massive resource that could make Canada a very, very wealthy country. The problem is environmentalists are very against pipelines. Now, pipelines are actually a very, very safe way of transporting oil. There's a lot of misconception about pipelines because of these environmentalists have a tendency of exaggerating facts or exaggerating stories about pipelines. And they also point out cases where pipelines have in the past leaked. What they don't mention is a lot of the leaks that the pipelines experienced were actually caused by environmental protests, where they actually sabotaged the pipelines. So it's environmentalists causing the problems that they later complain about. The really annoying thing is rail and truck as a means of shipping oil is actually very, very polluting. It's very, very dangerous as well. What happens is trucks spill the oil. Rails can derail, and that can cause big problems. We had a major issue a few years back where a whole town basically was almost destroyed because of a train derailing and the oil exploding. So there's a lot of issues with the transportation of oil, and one of the safest ways and most environmentally friendly ways is to use a pipeline. Now, the problem is this pipeline has to really just go right across the territory. And it's just like any other means of transportation. Well, like if you build a road or a rail, you have to go across territory. And the territory that it has to go across is native owned. A lot of it, the natives themselves actually want the rail to go through, and they want the pipelines to go through because it means a huge amount of jobs to the local communities. So most natives are actually pro pipeline. However, there's a small group within the native community that's very, very against it. The UN, for example, recently had a thing, I think it was like 2-3 years ago, I might be wrong about the dates, but they had a thing where they said that the indigenous people of Canada, the UN's trying to decide how we should live in Canada, they basically said the indigenous people of Canada have to have these certain rights And one of the things that they have to have is 100% agreement on anything that affects their territories. Now, the conservatives were against this, but a lot of people, especially on the left, really support this idea that they have to have 100% unanimous agreement on anything that's built on their land. So if one person disagrees, well, then everything's shut down. And that's really what's happening right now, is that the natives, majority of them agree that this is a good thing and it'll be good for the people in those territories, but a small group is protesting. And they're protesting because recently a judge blocked the protesters who were protesting this pipeline. They basically said, you got to stop protesting, and they basically kicked them out and said, they had the RCMP go in there, and which is Canadian Royal Mounted Police, and they basically kicked them out to block, because they were blocking the pipeline. When that happened, the natives took it one step further, and they decided to block ports. They decided to block railways. They decided to really try to shut down the Canadian economy because they try to block transportation within, especially of this oil. So as a result, they're doing things like they're burning like these pellets or burning cars on the railways or near the railways. And what happens is, these trains carrying like very explosive oil are like going through there and potentially running into these burning objects. It's a recipe for disaster. So far, we're lucky that nothing's happened. There was a train that did hit some these pallets, like these flat pallets, but no one was injured and no damage was done. So it's just one of those things where it could become a very explosive, literally explosive situation. And it's one of those things that we don't really understand all the facts, because the media is so emotional about the way that they're handling it. They're saying, oh, those poor natives, and they only look at the protesters. Well, the protesters represent a group of about 30 people. It's a very, very small group of people. And they're, for the most part, extremists within the native community who, want, special rights or something, beyond just no pipeline. They're extreme environmentalists. They're extreme in terms of colonialist agendas, very extreme left in terms of the way that they think. They think of Canada as a colonial power, and they have to fight against that colonial power. So these natives are basically causing a real problem. Now, the land, actually, where these rails are being blocked, is actually owned by CN. And so the land is actually CN land, and it is going through the territory that's associated to the suwet'en people. And also Mohawks are involved as well. So what happens is, if you think about just the basic concept of rule of law. Now, if I go to your house and I set up a big protest in front of your house and start burning stuff in front of your house, what would you do? You would just call the police and say, hey, police, get these people off my lawn, and the police would be like, sure, because these people are, causing mess, and they would kick them off and arrest them. Well, in Canada, we have Trudeau, and Trudeau is an idiot. He just doesn't have basic concept of rule of law. He's very lefty. He's very virtue signaling, like we have to protect the native people, blah, blah, blah. But he's not focused on basic property rights. And those property rights are very important. We have to protect property rights, because those same property rights that protect CN Rail also protect these native people, because if their property rights are protected, well, then they can decide how they want their property to be used. So it goes both ways. So what should happen is the police should go there and say, sorry, but you must, leave the area. But what's happening, and the natives, their complaint is the following: you cannot enter our territory. This is our land, and therefore you cannot impose Canadian law on our land, our territory. So that's the issue. That's the dynamic, that the natives see it as not really part of Canada in a way, even though they are part of Canada. They see it as separate territory with separate rules and laws. And the police, obviously, of that area are not willing to enforce the rules. And the RCMP, which is the National Police Force, is being instructed not to really go out and push these people away. And the government could step in and say, hey, look, you have to enforce rule of law, but we have a weak government that is not willing to do that. So as a result, rule of law is not being put into play. And this is what happens. So the net effect is CN Rail is just basically shut down. CN Rail, and also all these other ports and stuff are being shut down. They even had a protest where they were blocking subways, and they're trying to block all the different modes of transportation in Canada. So the whole nation's being shut down by these small protests, and sort of these protests that are associated to the other small protests. It's like other sympathetic people that are also protesting that are causing issues. And it's all these kind of left-wing people who virtue signal that, oh, we got to help these poor natives. And it's really annoying. And there's nobody that's willing to say, hey, children, go back and sort yourselves out, clean your own room. They act, because they are acting like children. They really should pursue this in a much more reasonable fashion. And that's kind of the problem in Canada. Nobody's being reasonable. Nobody's actually kind of thinking through what their actions are and what the desired outcome should be. So this is the situation in Canada, and it goes to show the power of socialism and power of left-wing thinking, that they can basically shut down major railways and transportation systems within a nation because they are too weak to go against a minority group. The sad thing about this was there was actually a huge company who had spent 10 years doing environmental assessments, working with the native chiefs, and they were going to build a huge mining / oil expedition place in Alberta. And it was going to be, probably raise anywhere from 15 to 20 billion dollars for the local communities. And most of those communities would be native communities. So all the native chiefs were actually on board, and they really wanted this to go forward. But because of these protests, the company decided to pull out, because it was just they spent 10 years getting all these approvals. The Trudeau government makes it really hard. They create all these crazy regulations, and they just were like, are we going to spend another billion? Because they spent $1 billion over those 10 years to get all these assessments. Are we going to spend another $1 billion just to wait another 10 years for something that'll never happen? So they just pulled out. And what it actually affects the Canadian economy so much because it's 1% of our GDP. It's a huge effect of the project. And it's all over stupid little protests that if you just had a sensible government in play, they would just say, no, go away. Get the police in there, get them off the property. But we don't have a reasonable government, and this is the problem in Canada. And I only see the situation getting worse because what's happening is once you start, it's sort of like the foot in the door situation where you give them an inch and they take a mile. And that's what's happening is the government isn't being strong enough, strict enough with them, so they keep on pushing more and more and more, and it's only going to get worse. So hopefully the government will uh, find some spine or something and will do something about this, because it's really hurting the country. And it's not a good time to be hurting the country because we've had Trudeau for over 5 years now, and the economy is getting very weak in the country. We're losing jobs. We lost half, or actually 60% of all foreign investment has been pulled out of Canada. It's just really getting scary locally for the economy, and we have to start getting rid of some of these regulations, and also reinforcing people's property rights, and get things moving again in Canada, and get some of these projects that really do create jobs and really do create wealth and actually help the natives get those started again. So I hope that you found this interesting. This is me just sort of explaining what's going on in Canada, and explaining some of the protests that are happening. A fun fact that I learned when I was doing research for this is the biggest shareholder in CN Rail. CN Rail is this rail company, is Bill Gates. So that's a fun fact. You can tell your friends. Who is the biggest shareholder of CN Rail? Well, it's Bill Gates. So that's just a fun fact. Please check out my other videos. Please comment on this one and like, share, and subscribe. And I'll check you out in the next video. Thanks. Bye.